At some point in the last couple of decades, fantasy made a drastic but rather quiet change. One day, goblins were the little green things crouching behind rocks waiting to stab adventurers. The next day, they were showing up in games and stories as surprisingly functional members of society. Suddenly, the goblin in your Dungeons & Dragons campaign wasn't just the thing everyone expected to betray you. He was the surprisingly competent locksmith with too many opinions. Or maybe he was the banker who handled your gold, like someone who really shouldn't have access to it. Or he was the merchant with that same suspicious grin every time he tried to upsell you on a totally safe experimental potion. They were still chaotic little disasters, but they were actually present. And the moment you notice that change, it becomes impossible to unsee it. Because it didn't just happen to goblins, it happened across the whole monster board. Vampires got to be lonely, misunderstood romantic partners. Orcs suddenly had culture, unions, and political platforms. Monsters stopped being savage, terrifying hazards, and started being characters. That's what this video is really about. The rise of the civilized monster. I don't know why I said it in that accent. Anyways, it's about how we went from slay the beast to monsters have jobs, stories, opinions, taxes, and occasionally really questionable fashion choices. How monsters turned from primal forces into full participants in the worlds they used to terrorize. It's a bizarre shift, a funny one, and honestly, one of the most interesting developments in modern fantasy. To understand how weird this shift is, you have to remember where monsters started. If we go back to the beginning, the real beginning, monsters were simple. In the earliest myths, they were treated like natural disasters with teeth. Grendel, from the Old English epic poem Beowulf, wasn't misunderstood. He was a walking problem, and Medusa didn't get a tragic origin until thousands of years later. In the original myth, she was simply an obstacle Perseus needed to remove. You didn't negotiate with a Cyclops, and you certainly didn't ask a Hydra how its day was going. If a monster showed up in the story, it meant one thing: something dangerous is here, and the hero needs to deal with it. The creature was a symbol more than an individual. Early fantasy followed this blueprint faithfully. Orcs existed just so you could cut through them while feeling heroic. Trolls were living sandbags you used to test new weapons. Dragons were massive, absolutely terrifying, loot boxes with wings. They were problems. Nothing deeper, nothing complicated. If you tried telling Beowulf that Grendel just needed someone to listen, he would genuinely think someone to listen was the name of a sword he hadn't found yet. But somewhere between Tolkien's language-infused orcs and the Trolls movie, monsters started changing. Slowly at first. Almost accidentally, but undeniably. Tolkien's orcs were still meant to be evil, but they argued, they complained, and they even had a bit of a chain of command. It was the tiniest hint that these creatures might actually be people with miserable jobs. But it made sense. They were supposed to be a powerful army, and adding a hierarchy isn't completely weird or unheard of. Then you jump forward a few decades and suddenly The Witcher arrives, and Geralt is out here interviewing monsters like they're part of a documentary series. Every creature has a reason, a story, a problem. Some are even victims of circumstance. Geralt isn't slaying beasts anymore. He's negotiating with them, sympathizing with them, sometimes even letting them go. And to be fair, it is really intriguing. It obviously worked, and people enjoyed this fresh outlook on monsters, even though I don't think that The Witcher was the very first one to introduce that, but it's probably the first successful one. From there, the floodgates opened. Hellboy walks into a government office every morning and clocks in like an employee with a very complicated dental plan that includes beating up demons. Undertale gives every monster a personality and a place in society. Baldur's Gate 3 doesn't just give you goblins. It gives you goblin social events, goblin nightlife, goblin celebrations that feel like someone mixed a cult ritual with a rave. And that's when you realize this isn't a single change. It's a whole movement. Monsters aren't just enemies anymore. They're neighbors. Sometimes annoying ones, sometimes dangerous ones, but neighbors nonetheless. So why did this transformation happen? Well, the first major reason is deceptively simple. Modern fantasy storytelling stopped being about lone heroes, and started being about groups, about parties, about found families, about dysfunctional squads that somehow still get things done. When stories shifted toward ensemble casts, every creature the characters met had to matter. They needed voices, motivations, and reasons to be part of the scene. A monster that exists only to be slain doesn't give you meaningful character interaction. The audience changed too. Players don't just want enemies. They want potential allies, informants, rivals, and unexpected friends. They want to talk, not just fight. They want choices. If today's D&D party meets a troll, half the table will pause before rolling initiative. Someone will say, "Hold on, maybe it knows something." Someone else will wonder if the troll can be reasoned with. Someone might try to recruit it, and obviously someone is going to flirt with it, because tabletop groups have no shame. The troll stops being a monster encounter and becomes an actual character. And once that happens, you can't put the genie or troll back in the bottle. The second reason is a bit more sophisticated. World building just got too good. Once writers started fleshing out the cultures of their worlds, it became impossible to keep monsters one-dimensional. The moment you answer questions like, where do goblins live? What do orcs eat? Do trolls have celebrations? You've accidentally built society, and society demands personality. Give a dragon a horde and you've given it preferences. Give it preferences, and suddenly you've defined what it values, what it hates, and what it might protect. And congratulations, your dragon is now a character. Ask what goblins do in their downtime, and suddenly you have goblin taverns, goblin blacksmiths, goblin scam artists, goblin accountants. And if you have that, then a goblin not wanting to stab humans anymore is not too far-fetched. World building pushes monsters toward civilization because you can't build depth halfway. Once you start giving creatures routines, belief systems, and infrastructure, they stop being mythical nightmares and start being people experiencing their environment. And then there's the, I think, biggest shift of all. The player perspective flipped. Modern fantasy didn't just let you meet monsters, it let you actually be them. When players can choose tieflings, half-orcs, vampires, beastfolk, or demons, the line between hero and monster dissolves completely. You stop seeing the other as an enemy and start seeing them as an avatar. Video games made this even stronger. Skyrim lets you become a werewolf or vampire. Dragon Age makes non-human characters deeply sympathetic companions. Even Pokemon reframed monsters as partners. Undertale taught entire generations that maybe fighting isn't the default answer. Fandoms were created and took it even further. Fan fictions gave them personalities and slow burn arcs. Memes turned eldritch horrors into lovable mascots. Entire subgenres centered around befriending, or, dating. No way that that's such a huge thing. What the fuck? The moment players started identifying with monsters, the old archetype fell apart. Monsters had to become civilized because the mostly civilized audience stepped into their shoes. It's hard to fear something when it's your favorite party member, or your player character. Now here we are, the era of the fully civilized monster. Monsters now have politics, they have culture, they have fashion, inside jokes, and interpersonal drama. They run taverns, cities, cults, and even governments. In The Witcher 3, higher vampires debate morality like they're at a philosophy seminar. In Dragon Age novels, Darkspawn develop inner lives. In CRPGs, demons have legally binding contracts and surprisingly organized nightlife. In anime, you get the demon lord who becomes the protagonist's roommate, or even is the protagonist himself. Monsters aren't lurking in caves. They're standing next to you arguing about diabolical rent prices. That shift opened up everything. Suddenly, fantasy worlds feel alive, not because of the humans in them, but because the non-humans aren't just hazards anymore. They're voices, perspectives, sources of humor, heartbreak, political tension, and cultural flavor. Civilized monsters didn't make fantasy softer. They made it bigger, more layered, more unpredictable. But, and this is important, we did lose something. When you humanize everything, you lose the unknowable, the primal. The thing that makes your stomach sink before your brain understands why. Pure horror becomes rarer because now the monster might actually have a point. Modern fantasy feels gentler because most creatures aren't symbols of cosmic terror anymore. They're just people. Strange people. Sometimes dangerous people. But fundamentally, people. And that's great for storytelling variety. But it means the genre has fewer moments where you genuinely feel powerless. Sometimes you need something ancient and unreasoning lurking in the dark. But here's the best part. We now have both. Classic monsters still exist. Civilized monsters exist right beside them. And fantasy is strongest when it uses the full range. A goblin can be the party's chaotic comedian, or the thing that shivs you while you sleep. A dragon can be a mentor, or an extinction-level event. A vampire can be a club owner, or a blood-sucking nightmare. The spectrum is huge now, and that's a gift for storytellers and writers. The rise of the civilized monster didn't remove fear. It expanded fantasy's toolbox. It made space for empathy, humor, diplomacy, absurdity, and horror to coexist without canceling one another out. So yes, goblins can be sophisticated gentlemen with monocles. Not because fantasy lost its edge, but because we, as players, writers, and fans, wanted monsters with agency, culture, depth, and occasional side hustles. But goblins could also hit your kneecap and rob you in an alley, so choose your goblin friends wisely.